So in this section, I want to go into pattern and the way, and I do this with a certain amount of trepidation because in some sense, patterns are really difficult to talk about. They're the water that we swim in that we don't see. When we perceive through patterns. We perceive patterns. Our memories are stored as patterns. And these are, let me concretize this a little bit more and say, it's patterns of various different places in our brains. At least it's that much. We don't really know we basically don't know how memory works. We know pieces of it. And we know that if you damage certain parts of the brain, then memory doesn't work as well. But the whole thing is still a fair bit of a mystery. Thinking is the process of combining and modifying patterns, basically. Concepts are patterns. And habits are patterns of action. Culture, in a big sense, is pattern. And changing culture is a matter of changing patterns. In the mind, patterns are based, if you go down, 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 it's all based out of experience. And I just want to bring this back to remind you of how rich our experience actually is. Even if we aren't paying attention to it, it's enormously rich. So there's a lot to draw on as we create patterns. Here's some of the neuroscience using brain imaging. So for instance, when someone would read or speak a sentence about mouths, about a mouth, it would be the same parts of the brain that are involved in sensing and sending muscle impulses to the mouth would light up, even though they were just reading it. Again, if they read or spoke a sentence about hands, then the same part, the same motor part, the same sensory part would light up. Very detailed in terms of just where it was on the brain. So when you are accessing that concept, you do it in part by reactivating all those places where you have either the muscle, both the muscle and the sensory experience. And then down here is a similar set. The leg-related words, you notice it's not just up here, it's a pattern all over the brain. Arm-related words. There may be a number of things that are in common between these two, but also important differences. Face-related words. And one of the things about patterns is that they can be both similar and different. They can overlap with each other. Patterns also wind up being based on each other. So we're not limited simply to the sense experience. So let's start with some direct experience of a color, a sort of range of color. Remember, there was a lot of range of color that got the same name. And then that becomes the concept of that color. And we can do that with a different color. And then we can take it even a step further and get the concept of color. Now, if you really think about it, you can't see the concept color. You can see individual colors, and you can know that colors fall in the concept of color. But color itself is an abstract concept. And we can go on and on and on from there. And the amazing thing is that our brains do it so easily. We build these whole huge structures. And one of the fancy things that our brains do is that as we move up those structures, we forget our roots. And so we start to see that the simplicity of those concepts, we mistake it for purity. I won't say anything more about that at the moment, but it's one of those things that definitely gets us into trouble. So not only can we generalize, but we can also have patterns that are based on each other. We can recombine, which of course is how you get a purple cow. And our imaginations are fabulous in terms of creativity, but we have very little that keeps us from imagining all kinds of things that are in effect purple cows that we nevertheless take for real. Another really important arena for pattern is metaphors and what I'm calling frameworks. These are the super nodes in the network of patterns. So metaphorical sources, and what I mean by metaphorical source is that if you've got a metaphor connects two things. You've got the source and then what it's connected to. Talk about a family tree. Then that linkage of relationships is the abstract. The tree is the metaphorical source. And that tree, that image of tree, of physical tree that we get to experience. Frameworks include beliefs and mental models and ideologies, and the reason I'm using the term framework for all these is that we tend to have these essentially pejorative terms that we use for other people's frameworks and nice terms for our own frameworks. And so I wanted something that was just framework, just covered it all. But these are essentially a set of concepts that in some domain explain how things work. Frequently, they are not based on experience. They're based on belief. And in fact, for many systems, the only way that you can have the system is to have some assumptions that enable it to go. Some frameworks can have a lot of basis in experience, but they don't all have to. And a lot of the patterns around us get interpreted either through metaphors or frameworks in one way or another. Important in scenarios, creating expectations. Here's a metaphor for you, that you can either look at negotiations as like a battle or like a journey. Depending upon which one of those metaphors you choose is likely to make a big difference, and you'll probably wind up with a self-fulfilling prophecy. And from a culture change point of view, metaphor and framework are the real leverage points. If you can change metaphors, then it ripples out into the whole system. If you can do a reframe in terms of the framework, it ripples out into the whole system. And at the same time, people are often really resistant if you just come along and say, you should toss your old framework and take mine. That often doesn't go down very well. So how to work with these frameworks is an important point. But from a human operating system point of view, this is where a lot of the real leverage lies. So I want to give an example here of a metaphor that maybe has a certain amount of framework to it. I'm going to compare two. One is the metaphor of two boxes, which is a metaphor for categorical thinking, where it's either in one category or it's in the other category. It's either true or it's false. There's no gradation. The other is continuum thinking, where there's the opportunity for all kinds of gradation. And what I want to specifically work with is signal and noise. This no doubt ties back into my astronomy, but I find it a very powerful metaphor. Powerful enough that I want to give you a little demo. So I'm going to start over here with pure signal. Can you hear that okay? Now let's introduce a little noise into that. But I'll bet you can still hear the signal. You can still track the signal. Ah. Can you still make out some signal? But I wanted to share the experience of that, not just the idea of that, with you. And then say, imagine if, as new information came to you, you didn't ask, is this right or is this wrong? You asked, what's the mix of signal and noise? And had the notion that, in principle, there was always some signal there, even if it was mostly noise. If we had a culture that wasn't always asking what's right and what's wrong, but instead was always looking for what's the signal, it would be a very different kind of culture. So I offer that as a metaphor, and I find in my own life it's very powerful to be able to keep tapping into, keep asking myself the metaphorical question, what's the signal? I want to throw the noise away, just over my shoulder, it doesn't matter. What's the signal? All right, I want to move on to another kind of pattern. It's a really profound pattern called object. And as very young children, as infants, object is one of the first things that gets clear in the brain. In fact, we probably come in with a certain amount of capacity to recognize objects, but it develops over the first few months. And by object, I don't just mean things, I mean people as well. Because for an infant, mother or caregiver is one of the most important objects in their world. Early and important, and we're hardwired for it. That what pathway is all set up to recognize objects. So what are some of the patterns of objects? Well, I want to say, first of all, it's the metaphorical source for nouns, for all nouns, basically. Comes out of our experience with objects. And an object is defined in space. It's like this. And a gazillion other things that you know of very well, like me here, where there's a clear, sharp edge that you're seeing. I occupy a certain amount of space. Somebody else isn't going to occupy that same space at the same time. The properties that are associated with an object attach to the object, and we learn to ignore things like the changes in reflection and the other ways in which this object depends on its context. We throw away the context part as we learn what objects are and develop what's termed object permanence, which is more like object continuity. And it makes a lot of sense. It works really well for us. But it's also, if it takes up too much of our metaphorical space, it gets us in trouble. So it creates subconscious confusion with non-object nouns. That's part of the problem with understanding patterns, is that your mind wants to understand patterns as if they were objects. And we'll come back to this next week when we talk about systems, because people want to understand a system as if it was an object, and it isn't. So it biases us against seeing relationships and their importance. But having seen that, we can take steps to compensate for that. All right. So patterns and reality. This is a picture of the sun, the way we all know it, right? It's that bright thing in the sky. Every human being, essentially, has some sense of the sun in this way. And if we were to look a little more closely, we'd see something like this. This is the sun looked at in the visible part of the spectrum. But the visible spectrum is only a very small slice of the overall electromagnetic spectrum. So what happens if we look at the sun and the ultraviolet. So here's a first step into the ultraviolet. And it's getting a little more blotchy, but it's not that different. Step again, step yet again. Now this is really weird. That's not the sun that I grew up knowing. And here we step just another bit and take it into another dimension. That's the sun being very alive and bleeding out into space. It does not have sharp edges. In fact, if you really look at what's going on with the sun as a whole, it goes way out beyond the orbit of Pluto. We are in the solar wind, which is material from the sun. And that's only stuff we now know. There is an enormous amount that we don't know, plus the fact that there are 10 to the 57 atoms, it's a huge number, 57 zeros of atoms in the sun, each one of them with their own unique history. Imagine trying to internalize and understand the history of all those 10 to the 57 different atoms. And that doesn't even get into questions of other dimensions of quantum entrainment, of who knows what. So my point in giving you too much information in this sense is just that our patterns about reality are always partial, and they're selective, both because of what we choose and because of the limits of our sensing systems. And we may extend those limits through cool instrumentation, but even that we don't, there's only so much that we extend there. And because they're partial and selective, they're always provisional. And I ran this through with the sun, but that's just a metaphor for every bloomin' concept in any human mind. Every concept, every internalized mental pattern, mind pattern, is going to be partial, selective, and provisional. That winds up meaning that you can't, with mind patterns, come up with you can't represent absolute truth. You can represent very useful truth, very useful ideas, but you're never going to get to that absolute, because there's always more to learn. And your experience winds up being personal and unique. So you can have your truth. That's cool. But that's not quite the same as saying that you've got something that is timeless, that will be there forever and ever. And you get this sort of issue. Suppose you have a conversation between two people. They're both talking about dog. Person over here on the left starts the conversation and says something about her dog, which she loves, which is a wonderful dog. Person over on the right happens to have really awful experiences with dogs. But because she's polite, she responds back to that dog statement from the first person. The first person just hears the word dog and interprets it in terms of her own associations. So we are caught in the echo chamber of our own associations. And it becomes very hard to be able to discover all of the various ways that the person that you're talking to is using words with different meanings. Not impossible, but difficult.